Sometimes the most broken souls find each other when the world has given up on both of them. When 55-year-old ranch hand Eli Mercer lost everything to drought and debt, he never expected to find hope at a dusty livestock auction. There, in a steel cage, sat a massive wolf that nobody wanted. Wild-eyed and dangerous, the animal had already sent 3 bidders running. But Eli saw something different, a spirit as weathered and stubborn as his own. With his last few dollars, he stepped forward and claimed what everyone else feared. What happened next changed both their lives forever. The wolf, whom Eli named Boone, became more than a companion. Strange things began happening wherever they traveled. Lost cattle found their way home, predators kept their distance, and forgotten paths seemed to open before them. But what was the real reason no one else could tame this wolf? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty lot of Hartwell's livestock auction, and Eli Mercer sat in his weathered Ford pickup, staring at a crumpled piece of paper that had changed everything. The foreclosure notice bore the official seal of Cattleman's First Bank, its cold legal language a stark contrast to the warmth that had once filled his life. 3 years ago, Eli had owned the Double M Ranch, 400 acres of prime grazing, land that had been in his family for 3 generations. He could still remember the smell of fresh coffee brewing in Martha's kitchen each morning, the sound of cattle lowing in the distance, and the satisfied ache in his bones after a day's honest work. Martha would stand at the kitchen window, her silver hair catching the morning light, watching him check the fence lines with the devotion of a woman who understood that loving a rancher meant loving the land itself. The drought had come like a thief in the night, stealing away everything they'd built together. First, the spring that fed the cattle troughs ran dry, then the pastures turned brown, and the cattle began to thin. Eli had sold off the herd piece by piece, hoping the rains would return. Martha had never complained, never suggested they give up. She'd simply taken on more hours at the diner in town, her calloused hands serving coffee to other struggling families, while her husband fought to save their legacy. When Martha passed during that second winter of drought, her heart giving out. From the strain of worry and hard work, Eli had buried more than his wife. He'd buried his purpose, his hope, and his connection to the life they'd shared. The bank had been patient, even sympathetic, but eventually the mathematics of loss became undeniable. The Double M Ranch was sold to cover debts, and Eli found himself with nothing but his pickup truck, his tools, and Martha's wedding ring, which he kept on a chain around his neck. Now, 6 months after losing everything, Eli lived in his truck and picked up work wherever he could find it. His hands, once smooth from ranch ownership, had grown rough again from fence mending, hay stacking, and any other labor that would put food in his belly and gas in his tank. At 55, he was still strong, still capable, but the fire that had once driven him had dimmed to barely glowing embers. The auction lot was already busy with ranchers, dealers, and curious onlookers. Jake Morrison, the auctioneer, was a fair man with a voice that could carry across 3 counties. He'd known Eli since they were boys, had bought cattle from the Double M more times than either could count. When Eli approached him near the auction ring, Jake's weathered face showed the kind of sympathy that came from watching too many good men lose their battles with circumstance. "Morning, Eli," Jake said, adjusting his worn cowboy hat. "Looking for work today?" Eli nodded, his throat too tight for easy conversation. "Got some fence work needs doing?" "Always do," Jake replied, his tone gentle. "Can pay you 50 for the day plus lunch." It wasn't much, but it was enough to buy gas and a hot meal. Eli had learned to be grateful for small mercies. As they talked, other men gathered around the auction ring, their conversations mixing reports of cattle prices with complaints about the weather and speculation about which ranches might go under. Next, Among the regulars, Eli recognized faces worn by the same struggles he'd endured. There was Samuel Price, who'd lost half his herd to disease during the drought. Tom Bradley, whose son had moved to the city rather than inherit a failing ranch. These were good men, honorable men, who'd simply found themselves on the wrong side of circumstances beyond their control. The morning auction proceeded with its familiar rhythm of bids and sales. But Eli found his attention wandering. His mind drifted to Martha, to the dreams they'd shared of passing the ranch down to children who'd never come. They'd been enough for each other, he and Martha, but in quiet moments he'd sometimes wondered what it might have been like to teach a son or daughter the ways of the land. It was nearly noon when the commotion started near the loading pens behind the main auction area. Shouts and cursing drew everyone's attention, and Eli followed the crowd to see what had caused the disturbance. In a heavy steel cage mounted on a trailer sat the largest wolf Eli had ever seen. The animal was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure, with coat that seemed to shift between grey and silver in the changing light. Its eyes were amber, bright with intelligence and something deeper, something that made even the hardest men take a step back. "Found him up in the mountains," explained Ray Hutchins, a trapper who occasionally brought exotic animals to the auction. "Been tracking cattle killers for the Morrison outfit. This one was alone, no pack. Figured someone might want him for a private zoo or something." The wolf's gaze swept across the gathered men, and Eli felt a strange recognition pass between them. Where others saw danger, Eli saw something familiar. The look of a creature that had lost everything it had once protected. The wolf's posture spoke of dignity maintained in the face of defeat, of spirit unbroken despite captivity. "Starting bid is 200, Jake announced, though his voice carried little enthusiasm. "Anyone interested in a fine specimen of mountain wolf?" The silence stretched long and uncomfortable. Even the men who collected dangerous animals for sport seemed reluctant to meet the wolf's steady gaze. There was something in those amber eyes that suggested this creature would never truly be owned, never be broken to another's will. As the minutes passed, Eli found himself drawn closer to the cage. The wolf's attention focused on him, and for a moment, the noise of the auction faded away. In that animal's eyes, Eli saw something he recognized from his own mirror, the exhaustion that came from fighting battles that couldn't be won, and the stubborn refusal to surrender even when defeat was inevitable. The crowd began to disperse as it became clear no one would bid on the wolf. Ray Hutchins looked frustrated, calculating the loss of time and effort spent capturing an animal no one wanted. Jake Morrison seemed relieved that he wouldn't have to conduct what might become a dangerous transaction. But Eli remained standing before the cage, his hand resting on the steel bars. The wolf didn't growl or bare its teeth. Instead, it moved closer, its massive head tilting slightly, as if studying this weathered man who wasn't afraid. In his pocket, Eli's fingers found his last $20, money he'd planned to use for gas and a room for the night. It wasn't enough for the starting bid, but as he looked into the wolf's eyes, he realized that sometimes the most important decisions weren't about what a man could afford, but about what he couldn't afford to lose. Eli stepped forward, his voice cutting through the afternoon stillness with quiet authority. "I'll take him." The word surprised even him. Jake Morrison turned, his eyebrows raising nearly to his hairline. "Eli, the starting bid is 200. You sure about this?" From his pocket, Eli pulled out his last $20 bill, worn soft from handling. "This is what I have." He paused, his fingers moving to the chain around his neck where Martha's wedding ring rested against his chest. The simple gold band caught the afternoon light as he lifted it over his head. "And this," the crowd murmured with a mixture of respect and concern. Every man there understood the significance of what Eli was offering. A man's wedding ring, especially one worn by a widow, wasn't just jewelry. It was the most sacred of possessions. Jake's expression softened with understanding. "Eli, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do," Eli said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. Martha always said everything happens for a reason. Maybe this is it. Ray Hutchins looked between the ring and his caged wolf, clearly torn between profit and conscience. That ring's worth more than 200, easy. Then we have a deal, Eli said, extending both the bill and the ring toward the trapper. The wolf had remained perfectly still during the exchange, its amber eyes fixed on Eli with an intensity that made several onlookers shift nervously. As Ray accepted the payment and Jake began preparing the paperwork, whispers spread through the small crowd. "That animal will kill him first chance it gets," muttered Tom Bradley. "Eli's lost his mind along with everything else," added another voice. But Samuel Price, a rancher whose weathered face spoke of 40 years working the land, stepped closer to Eli. "You got a plan for handling something like that?" Eli looked at the wolf, which hadn't moved from its position near the front of the cage. "Same plan I had for handling Martha when we first met. Patience and respect." Samuel almost smiled at that. "Your wife was a force of nature, but she wasn't a predator, wasn't she?" Eli asked, his own faint smile surprising him. "She certainly hunted me down and claimed me when no one else wanted an old cowhand." The comparison drew a few chuckles from the men who'd known Martha Mercer. She had indeed been legendary for her determination, and her devotion to Eli had been the subject of gentle teasing for decades. As Ray prepared to transfer the cage to Eli's truck, he offered final warnings about the animal's dangerous nature and unpredictable temperament. Eli listened politely, but his attention remained focused on the wolf, which seemed to be studying him with equal intensity. The loading process required careful maneuvering of Eli's modified pickup. Years ago, he'd reinforced the bed and added tie-down points for transporting cattle. Now, those modifications would serve an entirely different purpose. The cage fit snugly in the truck bed, and Eli secured it with the same methodical care he'd once used for prize bulls. Throughout the loading, the wolf remained calm, showing none of the agitation that might be expected from a wild animal being moved to unfamiliar surroundings. Several observers commented on this unusual behavior, but Eli wasn't surprised. There was something about the animal's demeanor that suggested intelligence far beyond normal wolf behavior. As the afternoon crowd dispersed, Samuel Price lingered near Eli's truck. "You planning to take him straight home?" Eli realized with a start that he didn't have a home to take the wolf to. His truck was his residence now, and clearly that arrangement wouldn't work with a caged predator. "Guess I'll figure that out." "As I go," Samuel studied him for a long moment. "There's something else you should know, Eli. Corporate folks have been sniffing around, buying up ranches. Not for grazing. They're paying well above market value, even for drought-damaged land. Nobody knows why." This news stirred something in Eli's chest, a familiar protectiveness for the land he'd lost. What kind of corporate folks? Company called Apex Development. Woman named Victoria Sterling runs their local operations. She's smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. Already bought out the Henderson place, the old Murphy Ranch, and 3 others in the past month. Eli frowned. The properties Samuel mentioned formed a rough line across the valley, encompassing some of the best water access in the region. What do they want with ranching land? That's the question, isn't it? Samuel glanced at the wolf, which had been listening to their conversation with apparent interest. Strange times, Eli. Strange times call for strange alliances. As Samuel walked away, Eli found himself alone with his new companion. The parking lot had emptied except for a few stragglers loading their own purchases. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows, and Eli realized he needed to find somewhere to spend the night, somewhere suitable for both man and wolf. He drove carefully out of town, heading for the foothills where he'd sometimes camped during his wandering days. The wolf rode quietly, its cage secured but its eyes alert to every detail of the passing landscape. Eli found himself talking to the animal as he drove, a habit he'd developed during long, lonely days. "Name's Eli," he said, checking the rearview mirror to see if the wolf was listening. "Eli Mercer. I suppose you need a name, too. Can't just keep calling you Wolf." The animal's ears pricked forward at the sound of his voice, encouraging Eli to continue. My daddy used to tell stories about Daniel Boone, the frontiersman, said he could read sign like other men read newspapers, could find his way through wilderness that would swallow lesser men whole. Eli paused, considering. Boone, that sound right to you? The wolf's tail moved once. Not quite a wag, but something close to acknowledgement. As sunset approached, Eli found a clearing near a small creek, sheltered by cottonwood trees and far from any roads. He'd camped here before during his darkest days after Martha's death, when the silence of his empty truck had become unbearable. Now the silence felt different, expectant rather than hollow. He parked the truck and stepped out, stretching muscles cramped from hours of careful driving. Boone watched his every movement with intense focus, but showed no signs of aggression. If anything, the wolf seemed curious about his new surroundings. Eli set up his modest camp, a small folding chair, a camp stove, and a bedroll that had seen better days. As darkness settled over the valley, he prepared a simple meal of beans and coffee, the familiar routine helping to calm his nerves. Throughout the evening, Boone remained alert but peaceful in his cage. When Eli offered him water in a metal bowl, the wolf drank deeply but carefully, never taking his eyes off the man who'd claimed him. Later, as Eli sat by his small campfire, he found himself talking to Boone about Martha, about the ranch, about the strange path that had brought them together. The wolf listened without judgment, his amber eyes reflecting the flickering flames. When Eli finally opened the cage door to offer food, canned meat that he'd bought with his last few dollars, Boone approached cautiously, but without fear. The wolf took the offered meal from Eli's outstretched hand with surprising gentleness, his teeth never threatening the fingers that fed him. In that moment, as a wild wolf accepted food from a broken cowboy under a canopy of desert stars, something fundamental shifted between them. Trust, fragile as morning frost but real as the ground beneath their feet, began to grow. The first week with Boone unfolded like a careful dance between two beings learning each other's rhythms. Eli discovered that the wolf was neither the savage predator others feared nor the domesticated pet some might expect. Instead, Boone possessed a dignity and intelligence that demanded respect rather than dominance. Each morning, Eli would wake before dawn to find Boone already alert, sitting calmly in his open cage. The wolf had quickly learned that he was free to come and go, but he chose to remain close to Eli's camp. This voluntary proximity spoke volumes about the trust developing between them. On the third morning, Eli sat cross-legged on his bedroll, working leather strips into a simple collar. His hands, skilled from years of ranch work, moved with practiced precision as he braided and tooled the leather. Boone watched the process with evident curiosity, occasionally sniffing at the materials. "Every respectable companion needs proper identification," Eli murmured as he worked. "Can't have folks thinking you're just some stray." When he finally approached with the finished collar, Boone remained perfectly still, allowing Eli to fasten it around his thick neck. The simple leather band, stamped with Boone in block letters, seemed to complete something important between them. That same morning, Jake Morrison drove out to the camp with a job offer that changed everything. His ranch foreman had quit unexpectedly, leaving him short-handed during a crucial time. "I need someone who knows cattle," Jake explained, his eyes cautiously tracking Boone's movements. "Someone I can trust. The pay isn't much, but there's a line shack you can use, and meals with the crew." Eli appreciated the offer more than he could express, but he had to be honest about his circumstances. "Jake, I come with complications now. Boone here isn't exactly your typical ranch dog." Jake studied the wolf, who sat calmly beside Eli's chair, showing no aggression despite the stranger's presence. "Tom Bradley called me yesterday, said you'd lost your mind buying that animal, but looking at him now." Jake shook his head slowly. "I've never seen anything like it. He's wild, but he's not dangerous. Not to you, anyway." "He's not dangerous to anyone who doesn't mean harm," Eli said with surprising certainty. "I can't explain it, but I know." Jake made his decision. "Bring him along. We'll see how the other hands react. If there's trouble, we'll figure something else out." The Morrison Ranch sprawled across 2,000 acres of mixed grazing land and hayfields. The main house sat on a rise overlooking the operation, with barns, corrals, and outbuildings spread across the valley floor. It was the kind of operation Eli had once dreamed of expanding his own ranch to match. When Jake introduced Eli and Boone to the ranch hands, the reaction was immediate and predictable. Seasoned cowboys who'd faced down bulls and broken horses took instinctive steps backward from the massive wolf. "That thing's gonna kill someone," muttered Carlos Reyes, the head wrangler. "Not if someone doesn't give him cause," Eli replied calmly. The test came that first afternoon when they needed to move a small herd of cattle from one pasture to another. The animals were skittish from the heat and drought conditions, prone to scattering at the slightest provocation. Normally, such a job would require 4 mounted men and considerable effort. Eli approached the task differently. Instead of mounting a horse, he walked into the pasture with Boone at his side. The wolf moved with fluid grace, never rushing or forcing, simply positioning himself where his presence would guide the cattle in the desired direction. The effect was remarkable. Instead of panicking at the sight of a predator, the cattle seemed to calm in Boone's presence. They moved as a cohesive group, following the subtle pressure of the wolf's positioning with none of the usual balking or breaking away. Carlos and the other hands watched in amazement as Eli and Boone moved the entire herd in half the usual time with none of the usual chaos. By the end of the day, fear had given way to professional respect. "I've been working cattle for 20 years, Carlos admitted to Jake as they watched Eli settle Boone in the line shack. "Never seen anything like what that wolf can do." Jake nodded, equally impressed. Eli's always had a way with animals, but this is something else entirely. The line shack was a simple but comfortable structure, built to house temporary workers during busy seasons. It had a wood stove, a decent bed, and enough space for both man and wolf to coexist comfortably. For Eli, it represented the first real home he'd had since losing the ranch. As evening settled over the valley, Eli developed a routine that would define their time at the Morrison Ranch. After the day's work was done, he and Boone would walk the boundaries of the property, ostensibly checking fence lines, but really just enjoying each other's company. During these walks, Eli began to notice things that didn't quite fit normal patterns. Animal tracks appeared, where none should be, deer paths that led to water sources, predator sign that seemed to avoid rather than threaten livestock areas. It was as if the natural order of the ranch was subtly reorganizing itself around Boone's presence. One evening, near a creek that ran along the eastern boundary, Eli discovered tracks that made him stop and study the ground more carefully. Mixed in with Boone's distinctive paw prints were others, coyotes, rabbits, even the delicate hoof prints of deer. They weren't random animal signs, but rather appeared to be following the same path Eli and Boone had walked. "You've got friends following us," Eli observed, kneeling to examine the tracks more closely. Boone sat beside him, his amber eyes scanning the darkening landscape with alert intelligence. As if summoned by their attention, a coyote appeared at the edge of the tree line, not approaching but not fleeing either. It watched them for a long moment before melting back into the shadows. That night, as Eli prepared for sleep in the line shack, he found himself thinking about the strangeness of his new circumstances. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a man with nothing left to lose. Now he had purpose again, meaningful work, and a companion whose very presence seemed to bring order to chaos. Through the window, he could see Boone lying in the doorway, positioned, where he could watch both the interior of the shack and the approaches from outside. The wolf never seemed to fully sleep, maintaining a level of alertness that spoke of deeper responsibilities than simple companionship. As Eli drifted towards sleep, he heard the distant howling of coyotes, not the usual chaotic yipping of a hunting pack, but something more organized, almost ceremonial. Boone's ears pricked at the sound, but he didn't respond in kind. Instead, he simply listened, as if receiving reports from distant sentries. In the morning, Jake Morrison sought Eli out with an offer that surprised them both. "I want to make this arrangement permanent," he said. "You and Boone have done more to settle the livestock in 1 week than my last foreman managed in 6 months. Whatever you're paying you for day work, I'll double it for a steady position." Eli felt a warmth he hadn't experienced since Martha's passing, the satisfaction of being valued for his skills and trusted with responsibility. As he shook Jake's hand to seal the arrangement, Boone sat calmly beside them, his amber eyes holding secrets that neither man could yet fully comprehend. By the end of their 2nd week at the Morrison Ranch, Eli had fallen into a rhythm that felt almost like the life he'd once known. The work was familiar, mending fences, checking water sources, maintaining equipment, but everything was different because of Boone's presence. The wolf had become more than a companion. He seemed to be actively participating in the ranch's operations. The first truly unexplainable incident happened on a Tuesday morning when Carlos discovered that 15 head of cattle that had wandered off during the night had returned to the main pasture on their own. This wasn't unusual behavior for cattle familiar with their home range, but these animals had been missing for 3 days and had somehow navigated around a washout that should have blocked their return path, found them all standing at the gate like they were waiting for breakfast, Carlos reported to Eli. But here's the strange part. They came back through Miller's Creek, and that crossing's been impassable since the spring floods. Eli rode out to investigate, with Boone trotting alongside his horse. At Miller's Creek, they found fresh cattle, tracks crossing at a point where the banks had recently been reinforced with stones and fallen timber. Someone, or something, had created a ford where none had existed before. Kneeling beside the improvised crossing, Eli studied the construction with growing amazement. The stones were placed with precision, creating steps that would allow cattle to navigate the creek safely. But there were no human tool marks, no evidence of machinery. The work looked almost natural, as if the creek had reshaped itself. Boone sat beside him, surveying the scene with what Eli could only interpret as satisfaction. When their eyes met, the wolf's expression held an intelligence that seemed to acknowledge responsibility for the mysterious construction. That evening, Eli sat at the small table in his line shack with a piece of paper and a pencil, sketching a rough map of the ranch and marking locations where unusual events had occurred. The returned cattle, the mysteriously repaired creek crossing, reports from other hands about predators avoiding the livestock. When he plotted these incidents, a pattern began to emerge. Each event had happened along routes that Eli and Boone regularly walked during their evening patrols. More intriguingly, many of these locations corresponded to old animal trails that had been unused for years, but were now showing fresh sign. It was as if Boone's presence was somehow reactivating ancient pathways across the landscape. As Eli studied his map, adding notes about each incident, he found himself thinking about the stories his grandfather used to tell about the old days, when the relationship between people and the land was different, more connected. Those stories had always seemed like fairy tales, but now he wondered if they contained more truth than he'd realized. His contemplation was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching the ranch. Through his window, Eli watched a convoy of black SUVs navigate the dirt road toward the main house. Even in the growing dusk, the vehicles looked expensive and out of place in the rural setting. Boone had risen from his position by the door, his ears pricked forward and his posture alert. The wolf's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. He sensed threat in these unexpected visitors. The next morning, Jake Morrison sought out Eli with a troubled expression. "Had some corporate folks here last night," he said, settling heavily into a chair on the line shack's small porch. "Woman named Victoria Sterling from something called Apex Development. Eli remembered Samuel Price's warning about corporate land buyers. What did they want? To buy the ranch, Jake replied flatly. Offered 3 times what it's worth, cash deal, quick closing. When I said I wasn't interested, she got very insistent about the benefits of selling. Benefits? Jake's weathered face showed a mixture of anger and concern. She knew things, Eli. Details about my financial situation, about market pressures, about problems with some of my neighbors. It was like she'd done a complete investigation before showing up here. This information stirred something protective in Eli's chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced since the early days of his marriage, when he'd been determined to build something lasting with Martha. The Morrison Ranch wasn't his land, but it had become his home, and Jake had given him a second chance when no one else would. What did you tell her? That the ranch isn't for sale, now or ever? Jake paused, studying Eli's face. But I get the feeling this isn't over. Sterling didn't strike me as someone who accepts no easily. That afternoon, as Eli worked on repairing a section of pasture fence, he noticed Boone behaving differently. The wolf's usual calm alertness had shifted to something more intense, more focused. He spent long periods sitting perfectly still, his gaze directed toward the road that led to the ranch, as if watching for approaching danger. During their evening walk, Eli found himself sharing stories about Martha with his silent companion. It had become a comfortable routine, talking to Boone about memories that had been too painful to voice since her death. She would have liked you, Eli said as they paused beside the creek where the mysterious ford had appeared. Martha had a way of seeing the best in everyone, even when they couldn't see it themselves. She used to say that sometimes the most important connections happen between unlikely pairs. Boone listened with the patient attention he always showed, his amber eyes reflecting the last light of day. In the growing darkness, other sounds began to emerge from the landscape around them. The distant howling of coyotes, the rustle of small animals moving through the brush, the gentle lowing of cattle settling for the night. But tonight, these familiar sounds seemed different, more organized. As Eli listened more carefully, he realized that the various animal voices were responding to each other, creating patterns of communication that stretched across the valley. Boone's ears tracked these exchanges, and occasionally he would make a soft sound in his throat. Not quite a whine, not quite a growl, but something that seemed to be his part of the larger conversation. "You're not just keeping me company on these walks, are you?" Eli asked quietly. "You're working, checking on things, making sure everything's running smoothly." The wolf turned to look at him directly, and in that moment, Eli felt a connection that went beyond ordinary understanding. Boone wasn't just a rescued animal, or even a companion. He was a guardian, watching over the land and everything on it with an intelligence that defied natural explanation. As they walked back toward the line shack, Eli noticed fresh tire tracks along the ranch road, multiple vehicles that had driven past during their absence. The tracks were recent, probably made within the last hour, and they belonged to the same type of heavy tires he'd seen on the Apex development vehicles. Boone growled softly, the first truly threatening sound Eli had heard from him. The wolf's hackles rose slightly as he sniffed the tire tracks, clearly recognizing something dangerous about their origin. Back in the line shack, Eli added this new information to his growing map, marking the location where the vehicles had passed and noting the time. The pattern was becoming clearer and more troubling. Whatever Apex Development wanted with the Morrison Ranch, they weren't giving up easily. As he prepared for bed, Eli found himself thinking about Martha's favorite, saying, "The Lord never gives us more than we can handle, but sometimes he comes mighty close to the line." Looking at Boone, who had positioned himself by the door with the alertness of a sentry, Eli wondered if he was about to discover exactly where that line was drawn. The decision to return to his old property came to Eli suddenly, triggered by the realization that he'd left behind more than just furniture and tools when the bank foreclosed. Martha's personal belongings remained in the house, her books, her sewing basket, and most importantly, the garden journal she'd kept for 15 years. If he was going to start over, he needed those pieces of his past. Jake gave him a Saturday off, understanding without explanation why this journey was necessary. Eli loaded Boone into the truck and drove the familiar roads toward what had once been home, his chest tight with emotions he'd avoided confronting for months. The Double M ranch looked smaller than he remembered, diminished by abandonment and neglect. The house, where he and Martha had shared their dreams, sat empty, its windows dark and unwelcoming. Weeds had begun to reclaim the yard Martha had tended with such care, and the barn where Eli had once stored hay and equipment stood open to the weather. Boone emerged from the truck with unusual solemnity, as if sensing the significance of this place. He followed Eli up the path to the front porch, his massive paws silent on the worn wooden steps. The current owner, a holding company that planned to subdivide the property for development, had given Eli permission to retrieve his personal belongings. Using the key he'd never been able to bring himself to surrender, Eli opened the door to his former life. The house still smelled like Martha, lavender and vanilla from the soaps she'd made, the faint aroma of her herb garden that had dried in. Jars throughout the kitchen. Eli stood in the doorway for a long moment, overwhelmed by memories that rushed back with painful intensity. Boone remained close as Eli moved through the rooms, gathering photographs, Martha's jewelry box, and the few books that held special meaning. In the bedroom, he packed the quilt Martha's mother had made for their wedding, its intricate pattern, now faded, but still beautiful. It was in Martha's small study that Eli made the discovery that would change everything he thought he knew about his wife. Hidden behind her regular garden journals, neat records of planting dates, weather patterns, and harvest yields, he found a different kind of notebook, one he'd never seen before. The leather-bound journal was filled with Martha's careful handwriting, but the subject matter was unlike anything he would have expected. Page after page detailed local wildlife behavior, noting patterns and relationships that seemed to fascinate her. But more intriguingly, she'd recorded stories and legends shared by the area's older residents, particularly members of the nearby Crow Nation reservation. One passage, dated just 3 months before her death, caught Eli's attention immediately. Joseph. Crowfeather stopped by today while Eli was checking the south pasture. He brought more stories about the old days, when the balance between human needs and natural order was maintained by guardian spirits. He says the animals are restless lately, that something is coming that will require the old protections. I've been watching our cattle, and they do seem different, more alert, more organized. Joseph says the land chooses its own guardians when the need is great enough. I wonder if he's trying to tell me something important. Eli sat heavily in Martha's desk chair, the journal open in his hands. She'd never mentioned these conversations with Joseph Crowfeather, never shared her growing fascination with local legends and spiritual beliefs. Had she been protecting him from ideas he wouldn't understand, or preparing for something she couldn't explain? The sound of a truck approaching drew his attention away from the journal. Through the window, he saw an ancient pickup pulling into the driveway, dust rising from its worn tires. The man who emerged was elderly, but moved with dignity, his long gray hair braided with leather and feathers. Even from a distance, Eli recognized him from Martha's descriptions. Joseph Crowfeather. Boone's reaction was immediate and profound. The wolf rose from his position beside Eli's chair and moved to the window, his tail moving in what could only be described as a respectful greeting. There was no tension in his posture, no wariness, only recognition. Eli met Joseph on the front porch, Martha's journal still in his hands. The elderly man's weathered face showed no surprise at seeing either Eli or the massive wolf who stood calmly beside him. I felt the presence, Joseph said simply, his voice carrying the weight of years and wisdom. When the guardian finally comes, those who are chosen always know. Guardian? Eli asked. Though some part of him already understood, Joseph's Dark eyes moved from Boone to the journal in Eli's hands. Your Martha was a wise woman. She listened when others thought they knew better. She understood that the old ways and the new ways must sometimes work together. They sat on the porch steps, Boone positioned between them like a living bridge, connecting two different worlds. Joseph spoke in the measured cadence of a storyteller, sharing legends that his grandfather had told him about spirits that appeared when the land faced great danger. The white wolf was always the strongest guardian, Joseph explained. They come when the balance is threatened, when those who take more than they give seek to poison the very source of life. Your Boone is not the first, but he may be the last if we cannot restore what has been broken. Eli found himself thinking about the strange incidents at the Morrison Ranch, the way animals seemed to organize themselves around Boone's presence. Martha wrote that you said the land chooses its own guardians. What did you mean? The guardian does not work alone, Joseph replied, his gaze steady and knowing. He needs a human partner, someone who understands that protecting the land means protecting everything that depends on it. Martha knew you would be chosen. That's why she asked me to teach her the old stories. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another vehicle, a sleek black sedan that looked expensive and out of place. Victoria Sterling emerged from the driver's seat, her business suit immaculate despite the rural setting. She approached with the confident stride of someone accustomed to getting her way. Boone's transformation was instantaneous, his relaxed posture shifted to high alert, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The sound was unlike anything Eli had heard from him before, not threatening exactly, but absolutely territorial. Mr. Mercer, Sterling said, her voice smooth and professional, I was hoping I might find you here. I represent some interests that would like to make you an offer for this property. Property's not mine to sell, Eli replied, rising slowly from the porch steps. Bank owns it now. Sterling's smile was perfectly calculated. Actually, my company has acquired the debt from the bank. We're prepared to offer you a generous settlement, enough to pay off your obligations and leave you with a comfortable sum. Besides, Joseph Crowfeather had remained seated, but his presence seemed to fill the space around them. Sterling's eyes moved to him with barely concealed irritation. This is a private business matter, she said coldly. Nothing about this land is private, Joseph replied calmly. It has been protected by my people for centuries. It will continue to be protected. Sterling's professional facade slipped slightly, revealing something harder underneath. Traditional. Claims have no legal standing, old man. This is about economic development and progress. Boone rose from his sitting position, his amber eyes fixed on Sterling with an intensity that made her take an involuntary step backward. The wolf hadn't moved aggressively, but his presence suddenly seemed to fill the entire porch. I think you should leave now, Eli said quietly, his hand resting on Boone's head. Sterling recovered her composure quickly, but her message was clear. This area is going to see significant development whether individual landowners cooperate or not, Mr. Mercer. It would be better for everyone if the process remained friendly. After she drove away, Joseph and Eli sat in contemplative silence. Finally, the elderly man spoke again. She's not the real enemy, just a tool of those who see the land as nothing more than resource to be consumed. But her presence here means the time for preparation is ending. The real battle is coming soon. As evening approached and Joseph prepared to leave, he placed a small leather pouch in Eli's hands. From your Martha, he said simply. She asked me to give this to you when the time was right. Inside the pouch, Eli found a collection of small stones, dried herbs, and a note in Martha's handwriting. For when you need to remember that love never truly dies, it just changes form. Trust Boone. Trust yourself. The land remembers everything. That night, back in his line shack at the Morrison Ranch, Eli spread Martha's journal and the contents of the pouch across his table. Boone lay nearby, his amber eyes reflecting the lamplight as Eli tried to process everything he'd learned. The pieces of a larger puzzle were beginning to come together, and at the center of it all was the growing certainty that his meeting with Boone at that dusty auction had been anything but coincidental. Joseph Crow Feather returned to the Morrison Ranch 3 days later, arriving at dawn when the valley was still shrouded in mist. Eli had been expecting him, though he couldn't say exactly why. Boone had been restless during the night, moving frequently between the line shack and the creek, as if receiving messages carried on the wind. "The medicine pouch your Martha left you," Joseph said, without preamble, as Eli poured coffee for both of them. "Have you tested it yet?" Eli admitted he hadn't known there was anything to test. Joseph took the small leather bundle from the table and loosened its drawstring, revealing the stones and herbs inside. As he did, Boone's head lifted sharply, his nostrils flaring as if scenting something significant. "Hold the largest stone while you're near Boone," Joseph instructed. "Feel for the connection." Skeptical but willing, Eli picked up a smooth piece of turquoise, warm to the touch despite the cool morning air. The moment his fingers closed around it, the world seemed to shift. He could sense Boone's presence more acutely, could almost feel the wolf's awareness extending across the landscape like invisible threads connecting to every living thing within miles. "This is impossible," Eli whispered, but even as he spoke he could feel the truth of what was happening. "Your Martha felt it too," Joseph said gently. "That's how she knew to prepare you for what was coming. The spirit wolves don't choose their human partners randomly, Eli. They choose those who can bridge the gap between the old understanding and the new necessity." Over the next hour, Joseph shared the complete legend that Martha had only partially recorded. The spirit wolves appeared during times of great ecological crisis, serving as guardians and guides for humans willing to remember their connection to the natural world. But they required human partners who could navigate both spiritual and practical realities. "The last spirit wolf was seen in 1952, Joseph explained, during the great drought that nearly destroyed this entire region. He worked with a rancher named William Strongheart to restore the water sources and heal the damaged land. When the crisis passed, the wolf disappeared, but the protection he established lasted for decades." Eli thought about the strange incidents. At the ranch, the way water seemed to flow more freely where Boone had walked, how predators avoided the livestock while other animals gathered peacefully nearby. "You're saying Boone is doing the same thing?" "I'm saying Boone is trying to, but this threat is different from anything the Guardians have faced before. The danger isn't natural disaster or even human ignorance. It's systematic destruction, motivated by pure greed. That requires a different kind of response." Their conversation was interrupted by Jake Morrison's arrival, his face grim with worry. "Eli, we've got problems. Sterling's people have been to see every rancher in the valley. They're offering amounts that are hard to refuse, especially for folks already struggling." The situation was worse than Eli had feared. Apex Development wasn't just targeting individual properties. They were orchestrating a comprehensive acquisition of the entire valley. Several ranchers had already signed preliminary agreements, and others were wavering under financial pressure. "There's a meeting tonight at the community center," Jake continued. "Sterling's called it herself, says she wants to address everyone's concerns about the development project." Joseph's expression darkened. "She's moving faster than expected. The longer Boone works to restore the natural balance, the more obvious it becomes what she's trying to destroy." That afternoon, Boone led Eli on a walk that felt different from their usual patrols. Instead of following familiar paths, the wolf headed toward areas of the ranch that Eli had never explored. They climbed rocky outcroppings, descended into hidden valleys, and discovered places that seemed untouched by time. At each location, Eli noticed the same phenomena he'd observed elsewhere: signs that the land was healing itself. Springs bubbled where none had existed in recent memory. Ancient oak trees that should have been dead from drought showed new green growth. Grass grew thick and healthy in meadows that had been barren for years. But most remarkably, they were no longer alone on these journeys. Wildlife that had been scarce or absent from the valley began to appear openly. Deer grazed peacefully within sight of them. Hawks circled overhead without hunting. Even traditionally aggressive animals like mountain lions watched from distant ridges with what could only be described as respectful attention. "You're gathering an army," Eli said to Boone as they paused at a natural spring that sang with clear, cold water. "But an army for what?" Boone's response was to lead him to one more location, a hidden canyon where ancient petroglyphs covered the rock walls. The symbols depicted scenes of cooperation between humans and animals, of balance and harmony that seemed almost mythical in the modern world. But they also showed something else. Scenes of great destruction followed by renewal, of darkness giving way to light through the combined efforts of guardians, both human and animal. The final panel showed a figure remarkably similar to Boone, standing beside a human protector, facing down forces that threatened to consume everything. That evening, the community center buzzed with nervous energy as ranchers and their families gathered to hear Sterling's presentation. Eli arrived with Jake, leaving Boone in the truck where his presence wouldn't distract from the serious business at hand. Sterling's proposal was seductive in its scope and apparent generosity. Apex Development would purchase all willing properties at above-market prices, providing relocation assistance and guaranteeing employment opportunities in the new development. The valley would be transformed into a modern resort and residential community that would bring prosperity to the entire region. "Change is inevitable," Sterling concluded her presentation. "The only question is whether you'll be partners in progress or obstacles to overcome." During the question period, several ranchers expressed concerns about water rights, environmental impact, and the loss of agricultural heritage. Sterling's responses were smooth and reassuring, but Eli noticed she avoided specifics about water usage or long-term ecological effects. When Samuel Price asked directly about impact on local wildlife, Sterling's answer revealed more than she intended. "Wildlife management will be handled by professionals to ensure compliance with all regulations. Any species that prove incompatible with development goals will be relocated to more suitable habitats." The casual dismissal of creatures that had called the valley home for generations triggered something protective in Eli. Before he fully realized what he was doing, he stood up. "What about the animals that can't be relocated?" he asked, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "What about the plants and insects and all the life that depends on this specific ecosystem?" Sterling's eyes fixed on him with recognition and barely concealed irritation. "Mr. Mercer, isn't it? I believe we've met. Natural systems are remarkably adaptable when managed properly." "Some things shouldn't have to adapt," Eli replied, thinking of Boone and the springs they'd visited that afternoon. "Some things are worth protecting exactly as they are." His words seemed to resonate with others in the room. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, and for the first time since Sterling had begun her presentation, the mood shifted from resignation to resistance. After the meeting, several ranchers approached Eli with questions and expressions of support. Carlos Reyes pulled him aside with news that added urgency to their situation. "My cousin works for the county planning office," Carlos whispered. "Says there are already applications filed for water extraction permits, industrial-scale permits, Eli. They're not planning a resort, they're planning to drain the aquifer." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Sterling's company wasn't interested in development. They were after the water itself, the precious resource that had sustained life in the valley for thousands of years. Everything else was camouflage for what amounted to environmental theft on a massive scale. As Eli drove back to the ranch with this new understanding, he found Boone waiting by the truck with an alertness that suggested he'd been monitoring the meeting from a distance. The wolf's amber eyes held knowledge and determination that mirrored Eli's own growing resolve. The battle for the valley was about to begin in earnest, and Eli finally understood why Martha had prepared him for this moment. Some fights were worth everything a man had to give, and some partnerships transcended the boundaries between species. In his pocket, Joseph's medicine pouch seemed to pulse with warmth, reminding him that he wasn't facing this challenge alone. The revelation came from an unexpected source. Maria Santos, who cleaned offices for various businesses in town, approached Eli after church the following Sunday with a manila envelope tucked nervously under her arm. "I found this in the trash at the Apex Development office," she whispered, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "I don't read English so good, but my daughter says it's important. Something about water." The document inside was a confidential surveyor's report, dated 2 weeks earlier and marked with warnings about unauthorized distribution. As Eli read, the blood drained from his face. The report detailed underground water reserves beneath the valley, describing an aquifer system that contained millions of gallons of pristine water, enough to supply major cities for decades. But the most damning information was in the geological timeline. According to the survey data, the aquifer had been artificially restricted by upstream dam construction over the past 5 years. The drought that had destroyed Eli's ranch and dozens of others hadn't been a natural disaster. It had been engineered by cutting off water flow to force property values down and make acquisitions easier. "They've been planning this for years," Eli said, his voice tight with anger as he shared the report with Jake Morrison later that day. The drought, the foreclosures, all of it was deliberate. Jake's weathered face showed a mixture of fury and disbelief. "You're saying they bankrupted half the valley just to steal our water?" "I'm saying they committed ecological warfare against their own neighbors for profit," Eli replied, thinking of Martha's final months, the strain and worry that had contributed to her heart attack. "And they nearly got away with it." That afternoon, Joseph Crowfeather arrived at the ranch with an urgency Eli had never seen in the elderly man. He'd brought several other tribal elders, their faces grave with shared concern. "The spirits are agitated," Joseph announced without preamble. "Something has changed. The balance Boone has been working to restore is under immediate threat." As if summoned by his words, Boone appeared from the direction of the creek, but he wasn't alone. Following him was a procession of animals that defied natural behavior: deer walking alongside rabbits, hawks perched on the shoulders of a massive elk, coyotes moving peacefully among domestic cattle. The sight was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. "He's gathering them," Joseph said with awe, "calling in all debts, mobilizing every alliance. This only happens when the threat is existential." Eli showed Joseph the surveyor's report, watching. The elderly man's expression darkened as he absorbed its implications. When Joseph finished reading, he looked at Boone with new understanding. "Now I know why he came," Joseph said quietly. "The spirit wolves don't appear for ordinary dangers. They come when the very source of life is threatened. Your Martha knew this was coming. That's why she studied the old stories so carefully." The memory hit Eli like a physical blow. Martha's final months, her strange fascination with conservation groups and water rights legislation, her unexpected friendship with environmental lawyers who had visited the ranch several times before her death. She'd been preparing for this battle, gathering information and resources that Eli had been too distracted by immediate survival to notice. "She knew," Eli whispered. "She figured it out before anyone else." Joseph nodded gravely. "Your wife understood that the drought was unnatural. She contacted my grandmother before she died, asked her to watch for signs of the Guardian's return. Martha knew you would be the one chosen to work with him." Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of multiple vehicles, Sterling's black sedans, accompanied by sheriff's deputies and men in business suits carrying briefcases. The official nature of the convoy was unmistakable and threatening. Boone's reaction was immediate and profound. The wolf stepped forward, positioning himself between the approaching vehicles and the gathered humans. At his movement, the assembled wildlife spread out in a protective formation that looked almost military in its organization. The message was clear. Any threat to the humans under Boone's protection would face opposition from every creature in the valley. Victoria Sterling emerged from the lead vehicle with a confidence that faltered when she saw the unprecedented gathering of animals. Her usual composure cracked slightly as she realized she was facing something beyond her experience or control. "Mr. Morrison," she said, addressing Jake while keeping nervous eyes on Boone, "I'm here to inform you that Apex Development has acquired legal authority to survey your property for eminent domain proceedings. These gentlemen represent the county and state agencies that will be conducting the assessment." Jake stepped forward, his decades of ranching authority evident in every movement. "This is private property, Ms. Sterling. You have no right to be here without permission." "Actually, we do," Sterling replied, signaling to one of the men with briefcases. "Emergency water rights legislation passed last month gives us survey authority for properties containing essential water resources. The legal documents were legitimate, rushed through during emergency sessions that most local residents had known nothing about." Eli recognized the sophisticated manipulation behind the strategy. Create the crisis, then use the crisis to justify the solution that had been planned from the beginning. But as Sterling's team prepared to begin their survey, something unprecedented happened. Boone let out a sound unlike anything Eli had ever heard. Not quite a howl, not quite a roar, but something that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. In response, the animals surrounding them began to move with coordinated purpose. Deer positioned themselves across access roads. Hawks and other birds filled the sky, their cries adding to the cacophony. Even insects seemed to swarm more thickly around the unwanted visitors. It wasn't aggressive behavior exactly, but it created an impenetrable barrier of living beings that made movement across the ranch impossible. "This is harassment," Sterling snapped, but her voice betrayed uncertainty. "I'll have the sheriff arrest all of you for interference with legal proceedings." "Arrest us for what?" Eli asked calmly. "We're standing on private property having a conversation. We can't control what wild animals choose to do." The standoff continued for several hours, with Sterling's team unable to move more than a few feet from their vehicles. Every attempt to proceed was blocked by walls of wildlife that materialized wherever they tried to go. The animals showed no aggression, but their presence was absolute and unyielding. Finally, as the sun began to set, Sterling retreated with threats of legal action and promises that the survey would proceed with or without cooperation. As her convoy disappeared down the ranch road, the assembled animals began to disperse, but not before each species seemed to pay individual respects to Boone. "I've never seen anything like that," Jake said, his voice filled with wonder and concern. "It was like they were taking orders." "They were," Joseph replied simply. "Boone didn't just call them, he organized them. The spirit wolves can coordinate natural resistance in ways that human minds can barely comprehend." That night, as the ranch settled into an uneasy quiet, Boone approached Eli with clear intention. The wolf's posture and expression conveyed urgent communication, and Eli found himself following without question. They walked through the darkness, guided by moonlight and Boone's sure knowledge of the terrain. Their destination was a high ridge that overlooked the entire valley. From this vantage point, Eli could see the full scope of what Sterling's company planned to destroy. Springs gleamed like silver threads in the moonlight, connecting meadows and forests in an intricate web of life. Ancient trees stood sentinel over grasslands, where wild horses grazed peacefully alongside cattle. It was a complete ecosystem, balanced and thriving despite the artificial drought that had been imposed upon it. But Eli also saw what others couldn't, the places where Boone's influence had begun to heal the damage. New growth marked the wolves. Regular paths and the sound of running water was stronger than it had been in years. Boone wasn't just protecting the existing ecosystem, He was actively restoring what human interference had damaged. "You're not just a guardian," Eli said quietly, understanding finally dawning. "You're a healer. You came here to fix what they broke." Boone turned to face him directly, and in those amber eyes, Eli saw acknowledgement and something more, a request for partnership that transcended species boundaries. The wolf couldn't complete his mission alone. He needed a human ally who could navigate legal systems, rally community support, and bridge the gap between natural wisdom and political necessity. Standing on that ridge, with the entire valley spread below them, Eli felt Martha's presence as clearly as if she were standing beside him. Her years of research, her careful preparation, her faith that he would be chosen for this purpose, all of it came together in a moment of perfect clarity. "I understand now," Eli whispered to the night sky, thinking of his wife's final words, about love changing form rather than dying. "This is why you brought us together, isn't it? This is what she was preparing me for." Boone's soft whine carried agreement and gratitude. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, legal battles, and escalating pressure from forces that saw the valley only as a resource to be exploited. But tonight, standing under stars that had witnessed countless partnerships between humans and the natural world, Eli accepted his role as guardian of something infinitely more valuable than money. The war for the valley's soul was about to begin, and Eli Mercer finally understood why a broken cowboy and a spirit wolf had found each other when the world needed them most. The old ranch bell had hung silent in Jake Morrison's barn for 20 years, a relic from the days when ranchers communicated across vast distances through sound alone. Eli found it buried under tarps and forgotten equipment, its bronze surface green with age, but its voice still true when he tested it with a wooden mallet. "Haven't heard that sound since my grandfather's." "Time," Jake said, emerging from the house at the unexpected clanging. "Used to call for help during emergencies, fire, flood, or trouble that needed every able-bodied man in the valley." "This qualifies," Eli replied, loading the bell into his truck. "Sterling's bringing in her full team tomorrow. Legal papers, security forces, the whole corporate army. If we're going to make a stand, it has to be now." Word spread through the valley with the efficiency that only comes in tight-knit communities facing existential threats. Eli drove from ranch to ranch, the old bell clanging from his truck bed, its sound carrying his message across the hills. By evening, trucks and ATVs converged on the Morrison Ranch from every direction. Samuel Price arrived first, followed by Carlos Reyes and his extended family. Tom Bradley brought his grown sons and their neighbors. Even families who had been considering Sterling's offers came to hear what Eli proposed. The barn filled with weathered faces and calloused hands, men and women who had spent their lives working the land and understood what was at stake. "They want to steal our water," Eli began, without preamble, holding up the surveyor's report. "Not just to develop the valley, but to drain the aquifer that feeds everything within 50 miles. They caused the drought that broke half our ranches, and now they want to finish the job." The room erupted in angry voices as Eli shared the details of Sterling's plan. Ranchers who had blamed themselves for failures beyond their control learned that they had been victims of deliberate manipulation. The revelation transformed individual grief into collective fury. "What do you propose we do about it?" Samuel Price asked when the noise died down. Eli had spent the previous night developing a strategy that drew on decades of leadership experience he'd forgotten he possessed. Before ranching had claimed his life, he'd served as a volunteer firefighter, organized community disaster response, and coordinated search and rescue operations. Those skills had lain dormant since Martha's death, but they surfaced now with startling clarity. "We make them understand that taking our water means fighting every person and every creature that depends on it," Eli said. "Legal resistance, media attention, and direct action. We document everything they're doing, get outside support, and make this so expensive and complicated that they give up and move on." Jake Morrison stepped forward with information that added weight to Eli's plan. "I've been talking to environmental lawyers in the state capital. They say if we can prove the drought was artificially created, we might be able to get federal agencies involved. Interfering with natural water systems is a crime under several laws." The organizing session continued past midnight, with committees forming to handle different aspects of their resistance. Carlos volunteered to coordinate with tribal authorities, while Tom Bradley's sons took responsibility for media outreach. Women from the various families organized food and medical support, understanding that any confrontation might last days. But even as they planned their human response, everyone in the barn was aware of the larger forces gathering outside. Through the windows, they could see animals moving through the darkness, not the random wandering of normal wildlife, but purposeful migration towards some common destination. Joseph Crow Feather arrived near dawn with a convoy of vehicles carrying tribal elders, environmental activists, and lawyers who had been fighting water rights battles across the West. His presence transformed their local resistance into something larger and more significant. "The spirits have been active all night," Joseph reported to Eli as they watched the sun rise over the valley. "My grandmother says she can feel them moving, gathering strength for what's coming. This isn't just about one valley anymore. It's about drawing a line against forces that would consume everything natural in the world." Boone had been absent during most of the human preparations, but he returned at first light with mud on his paws and an urgency in his movements that demanded attention. The wolf approached Eli with clear intention, his posture indicating the need for immediate action. "He wants to show you something," Joseph interpreted. "Something important." Eli followed Boone away from the organized chaos of the ranch, walking through morning mist toward a part of the valley he'd never explored. Their destination was a natural amphitheater hidden among towering rock formations, where a spring emerged from the earth with such force that it created its own small river within 100 yards. But this wasn't just any water source. As Eli knelt beside the spring, he could feel its significance in his bones. The water was cold and pure, with a mineral taste that spoke of deep aquifers and ancient purity. More importantly, it was the source that fed every other water system in the valley, the mother spring from which all other life depended. "This is what they really want," Eli breathed, understanding flooding through him. "Not the whole aquifer, but this specific source. Control this, and you control everything downstream." Boone's amber eyes held grim confirmation. Sterling surveys and legal maneuvers had all been designed to secure access to this single point. Once Apex Development owned the mother spring, they could regulate or eliminate water flow to every ranch, every wild area, every living thing that depended on the valley's ecosystem. As they stood beside the spring, Eli became aware that they were not alone. Animals had been gathering throughout the night, drawn by some communication system that transcended human understanding. Deer grazed peacefully alongside domestic cattle. Wild horses stood in formation with ranch horses. Predators and prey occupied the same space without conflict, united by some deeper understanding of the threat they faced. The sight was both beautiful and deeply moving. Eli realized he was witnessing something that might never happen again, the conscious cooperation of every living thing in an ecosystem, working together to protect their shared home. The spell was broken by the distant sound of helicopters. Sterling's forces were arriving in strength, and their approach carried the weight of serious opposition. Through binoculars, Eli could see multiple aircraft carrying equipment, personnel, and what appeared to be private security contractors. "Time to go," he said to Boone, but the wolf was already moving, leading them back toward the Morrison Ranch along paths that kept them hidden from aerial observation. They arrived to find the human coalition had swelled beyond anything Eli had expected. News of their resistance had spread through social media and environmental networks, bringing supporters from across the region. College students with protest signs stood alongside elderly ranchers with rifles. Professional activists organized chants, while tribal elders prepared traditional ceremonies. But Sterling's response was equally impressive in its scope and intimidation. The convoy that arrived at mid-morning included corporate executives, government officials, private security forces, and enough legal firepower to overwhelm most opposition. They established a command post on public road access, clearly prepared for a siege. As the two forces faced each other across several hundred yards of contested ground, Eli found himself thinking of Martha and the faith she'd shown in preparing him for this moment. He slipped away from the crowd, driving alone to the small cemetery where she was buried. Martha's grave sat beneath a cottonwood tree that had somehow survived the drought, its leaves whispering secrets in the morning breeze. Eli knelt beside the simple headstone, placing his hand on the earth that covered the woman who had shaped his understanding of love and purpose. "I'm scared, Martha," he admitted quietly. "Scared I won't be strong enough for what's coming. Scared I'll let everyone down." The wind through the cottonwood leaves seemed to carry her voice, reminding him of something she'd said during their last difficult winter together. "Strength isn't about not being afraid, Eli. It's about doing what needs. Doing despite the fear." When he returned to the ranch, the standoff had intensified. Sterling's forces had positioned themselves at every legal access point, while the coalition of ranchers, activists, and tribal members held defensive positions around the primary water sources. Between them, Boone moved with a growing pack of wolves that had emerged from the mountains. Not captive animals like himself, but wild creatures that had answered some ancient call to gather. "How many?" Eli asked Carlos, who had been counting the assembled opposition forces. "Sterling has maybe 50 people, plus all the legal backing," Carlos replied. "We've got twice that number, but most of our folks are just ordinary people with everything to lose. Sometimes that's the strongest motivation of all," Eli said, watching Boone organize his wolf pack with the precision of a military commander. As afternoon shadows lengthened toward evening, both sides made final preparations for whatever confrontation morning would bring. Sterling's people established camp with military efficiency, their equipment and organization suggesting this was far from their first such operation. The defenders arranged themselves in groups around key locations, ready to document and resist any attempt to seize control of the water sources. But the real drama was unfolding in the natural world, where Boone's influence had created something unprecedented. Every species native to the valley had gathered in peaceful congregation, creating living barriers around springs, streams, and sensitive ecological areas. It was as if the land itself had awakened to defend against invaders. Standing on the porch of the line shack as stars emerged in the clear mountain sky, Eli felt the weight of everyone's faith and expectations. Tomorrow would determine whether a small community could stand against corporate power, whether natural law could triumph over legal manipulation, whether the partnership between a broken cowboy and a spirit wolf could save something infinitely precious from destruction. In his pocket, Joseph's medicine pouch pulsed with warmth, reminding him that some battles are won not through force, but through the courage to stand for principles that transcend immediate self-interest. As Boone appeared from the darkness to stand beside him, Eli knew that whatever came with the dawn, they would face it together. Dawn came with the sound of helicopters and the rumble of heavy vehicles, shattering the peaceful quiet that had settled over the valley during the night. Victoria Sterling's forces moved with military precision, establishing a perimeter around the mother spring, while their legal team prepared documents that would transfer water rights to Apex Development under emergency authority provisions. Eli watched from a ridge above the spring as Sterling emerged from her command vehicle, flanked by private security contractors whose bearings suggested military experience. She carried a leather briefcase containing contracts that would legally seal the valley's fate, documents backed by enough governmental authority to override local resistance. But as Sterling's convoy approached the mother spring, They found their path blocked by something unprecedented in modern corporate warfare. Boone stood directly in front of the spring's source, his massive form radiating an authority that made even armed contractors hesitate. Behind him, the water bubbled and sang with unusual intensity, as if responding to his presence. The wolf wasn't alone. During the night, every major species in the valley had gathered in defensive formation around their primary water source. Elk stood shoulder to shoulder with domestic cattle. Mountain lions lay peacefully among sheep. Hawks and eagles perched on the antlers of deer, creating a living tableau that defied natural law. "What the hell is this?" one of Sterling's security men muttered, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. "Stand down!" Sterling commanded sharply. "We're not here to harm animals. We're here on legal business." But as she approached the spring with her legal team, the assembled wildlife closed ranks with coordinated precision that spoke of intelligence far beyond instinct. They didn't threaten or attack. They simply made passage impossible through the sheer fact of their organized presence. Eli emerged from the coalition's defensive positions, walking calmly down the slope toward the confrontation. Every eye, human and animal, tracked his movement as he took his place beside Boone, facing down the corporate forces that had engineered years of suffering and manipulation. "Ms. Sterling," Eli said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air, "you're trespassing on land that doesn't belong to you." Sterling's confident facade showed the first signs of strain as she gestured toward the gathered animals. "This is some kind of trained exhibition, isn't it? An attempt to create sympathy through theatrics." "Look at them," Eli said simply. "Really look. When did you ever see predators and prey sharing the same space? When did you ever see wild animals cooperating with domestic ones? This isn't training. This is something your corporate mind can't understand." Sterling opened her briefcase and removed a stack of legal documents, their official seals gleaming in the morning sunlight. "I have emergency water rights acquisitions signed by county, state, and federal authorities. This spring and its surrounding territory are now under Apex Development Management, effective immediately." She extended the papers toward Eli, expecting the usual capitulation that legal authority typically commanded. But as she did, Boone stepped forward with fluid grace, his amber eyes fixed on the contracts with unmistakable intent. What happened next challenged everything Sterling thought she knew about the natural world. Boone didn't growl or bare his teeth. Instead, he opened his mouth and breathed across the legal documents, a soft exhalation that should have been harmless. But the contracts began to smolder, as if touched by invisible flame. The expensive paper curled and blackened, official seals melting away like wax. Within seconds, years of legal maneuvering and corporate manipulation were reduced to ash that scattered on the morning breeze. Sterling stared in shock at her empty hands, her mind struggling to process what she'd witnessed. "That's impossible," she whispered. "Impossible according to what?" Eli asked. "According to laws written by people who've forgotten that humans aren't the only intelligence in the world? According to assumptions that everything can be owned, controlled, and exploited?" The security contractors were backing away from Boone with expressions that mixed professional training with primitive fear. Their weapons and body armor provided no protection against forces that operated outside conventional understanding. But Boone's demonstration was only the beginning. As if responding to some signal inaudible to human ears, the wildlife gathered around the spring began to move with synchronized purpose. Birds filled the sky in formations that created living clouds. Ground animals arranged themselves in concentric circles that pulsed with coordinated movement. The earth itself seemed to respond. The spring's flow increased, sending fresh water cascading down channels that carved new paths through the landscape. Trees that had appeared dead from drought suddenly showed green shoots. Grass sprouted from ground that had been barren for years, "You're witnessing the land defending itself," Joseph Crowfeather announced as he appeared among the coalition supporters. "The old agreement between humans and nature, activated when survival is at stake." Sterling's composure finally cracked completely. "This is some kind of hoax, some elaborate deception using special effects and trained animals. I'm calling for federal marshals to clear this area immediately." "Go ahead," Eli said calmly. "Call whoever you want, but ask yourself this: how do you explain what you've seen to people who weren't here? How do you convince rational authorities that a wolf destroyed your legal documents by breathing on them?" The security contractors were openly retreating now, their professional discipline overridden by instinctive recognition of forces beyond their training. Their equipment and tactics were designed to handle human resistance, not the coordinated opposition of an entire ecosystem. As Sterling's forces withdrew to regroup and reassess, Eli found himself addressing not just her, but the cameras that coalition supporters had been using to document the confrontation. His words were meant for a broader audience that needed to understand what was really at stake. "This valley isn't just land to be bought and sold," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had found his true purpose. "It's a living system that has sustained life for thousands of years. The water that flows from this spring doesn't belong to any corporation. It belongs to every creature that depends on it for survival." He gestured toward the assembled wildlife, their peaceful cooperation creating a scene that would defy explanation in any corporate boardroom or government office. "These animals aren't here by accident. They're here because they understand something that modern humans have forgotten, that all life is connected, and when one part is threatened, everything is threatened." Sterling's response was to retreat to her command post and begin making urgent phone calls, seeking higher authorities and greater legal powers. But even as she escalated the corporate response, something fundamental had shifted in the confrontation. The coalition of ranchers, activists, and tribal members had witnessed power that transcended human law. They had seen nature itself mobilize in defense of its most essential resource. Most importantly, they had seen that resistance was possible, that even the largest corporate forces could be confronted when ordinary people found extraordinary courage. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the valley, both sides prepared for the next phase of a battle that would determine whether ancient partnerships between humans and nature could survive in a world increasingly dominated by those who saw everything as commodity to be consumed. The transformation began with a change in the wind. What had been still morning air suddenly stirred with currents that carried moisture and electricity, pulling clouds from distant mountains toward the valley. Boone stood at the center of the phenomenon, his silver-gray coat rippling as if touched. By invisible forces, Sterling's retreat had been temporary. Within an hour, she returned with federal marshals, environmental enforcement officers, and legal documents that carried the weight of national emergency powers. Her corporate machinery was designed to overwhelm local resistance through sheer bureaucratic mass, but she was about to learn that some forces operate beyond the reach of human law. "I have federal authority to secure this water source for national security purposes," Sterling announced to the assembled crowd through a portable sound system. "Any interference with this operation constitutes obstruction of federal officers in the performance of their duties." But even as she spoke, the sky above the valley was darkening with clouds that built from nothing, swirling in patterns that defied meteorological explanation. The air itself seemed to vibrate with potential energy, and every animal present turned their attention skyward with expressions of anticipation. Boone lifted his head and released a sound that wasn't quite a howl, but something deeper and more primal, a call that seemed to resonate through the earth itself. In response, the gathered wildlife began to move in slow, ritualistic patterns around the spring, their synchronized movement creating currents of energy that Eli could feel in his bones. "What are they doing?" Sterling demanded, her professional composure finally showing real cracks, Joseph Crowfeather stepped forward with the dignity of someone speaking ancient truths. "They're completing the restoration. Your people broke the natural water cycle by damming the upstream sources. Now the Guardian is fixing what you damaged." The first drops of rain fell like a benediction, each one carrying the promise of renewal. But this wasn't ordinary precipitation. The water fell with purpose, seeking specific destinations with impossible precision. Dry creek beds began to sing as water returned to channels that had been silent for years. Plants that had appeared dead suddenly showed signs of life as roots deep underground received the moisture they'd been denied. Sterling's legal team was scrambling to maintain relevance in the face of forces that rendered their documents meaningless. If the drought broke naturally, their emergency powers would evaporate. Their entire strategy depended on artificial scarcity that was dissolving with every raindrop. "Stop this," Sterling commanded Eli, as if he had control over what was happening. "Whatever technology you're using, whatever staged environmental manipulation this represents, it ends now." Eli looked at her with something approaching pity. "Miss Sterling, you've spent so much time in boardrooms and legal offices that you've forgotten the world doesn't run on corporate schedules. Some things are bigger than your quarterly profit projections." The rain was intensifying now, falling, with the steady rhythm of genuine weather patterns. Federal marshals found themselves retreating to their vehicles as the downpour made their official documents illegible and their equipment vulnerable to water damage. The absurdity of trying to serve legal papers during a miraculous end to artificial. Drought wasn't lost on anyone present, but Boone wasn't finished. As the rain reached its peak intensity, he approached the spring's source and placed his paw on a smooth stone that seemed to emerge from the earth specifically for his touch. The moment of contact sent visible ripples of energy across the water's surface, and the spring's flow increased to a torrent that carved new channels through the landscape. The stone itself began to glow with soft, warm light that pulsed in rhythm with Boone's heartbeat. When the wolf stepped back, the light remained, transforming an ordinary rock into something that radiated peace and protection. Without hesitation, Boone picked up the stone in his mouth and carried it to Eli, placing it gently in his outstretched hands. The moment Eli's fingers closed around the sacred spring stone, he felt the full extent of Boone's power flowing through the valley. Every stream, every underground aquifer, every drop of water within hundreds of miles was part of a vast network that the spirit wolf could sense and influence. The drought hadn't been broken. It had been healed, restored to the natural patterns that had sustained life in this region for millennia. Sterling's defeat was complete and undeniable. Her legal documents were worthless without the artificial scarcity that justified emergency measures. Her corporate backing would evaporate when shareholders learned that their water acquisition strategy had been undermined by natural restoration that made their expensive infrastructure irrelevant. "This isn't over," Sterling said as she retreated toward her vehicles, but her threat carried no conviction. "My company has investments that need protecting. We'll find other legal avenues." "Good luck with that," Jake Morrison called after her, rain streaming down his weathered face like tears of joy. "Hard to claim emergency water rights when there's no emergency." As Sterling's convoy disappeared down the muddy ranch road, the coalition of defenders erupted in celebration that mixed human joy with animal satisfaction. Ranchers embraced neighbors they'd been feuding with for years. Tribal elders performed ceremonies of gratitude, while college activists documented the most successful environmental action in decades. But the real celebration was happening in the natural world, where every creature that depended on the valley's water was experiencing relief from years of artificial deprivation. Birds sang with unusual complexity. Cattle lowed with contentment as they drank from streams that ran clear and strong. Even insects seemed to hum with greater energy as the ecosystem returned to its proper balance. Joseph Crowfeather approached, Eli with ceremonial solemnity, carrying a beaded headband that had been worn by tribal water guardians for generations. "The spirits have accepted you," he said, placing the band around Eli's forehead. "You and Boone have proven worthy of the trust they placed in you." The formal recognition felt both overwhelming and perfectly natural. Eli had never sought leadership, but leadership had found him anyway, emerging from the partnership with a creature that saw beyond human limitations to the deeper connections that sustained all life. As evening settled over the valley, now blessed with the sound of running water and the scent of growing things, Boone approached Eli with an expression that mixed gratitude with something like farewell. The wolf's work in this specific location was complete, but his responsibilities extended far beyond a single valley. "You're leaving," Eli said, reading the message in those amber eyes. Boone's response was to touch his nose gently to Eli's hand, a gesture of affection and respect that confirmed their bond would survive physical separation. The spirit wolf had other places where the balance needed restoration, other partnerships to forge, other battles to fight. But as Boone disappeared into the darkness, heading toward mountains that held their own mysteries and challenges, Eli understood that something fundamental had changed in his life. He was no longer a broken man living in his truck, surviving on odd jobs and memories. He was a guardian, protector of something infinitely precious, keeper of partnerships that bridged the gap between human needs and natural wisdom. The sacred springstone pulsed warm in his hands, a constant reminder that some responsibilities transcend individual lifetimes. He was part of something larger now, something that had existed long before his birth and would continue long after his death. Standing in the rain beside the restored spring, surrounded by friends who had become family and charged with protecting one of the most beautiful places on earth, Eli Mercer finally understood what Martha had meant when she said that love never dies. It just changes form. 6 months after the rains returned, Eli stood in his workshop carving letters into a piece of weathered oak that Jake Morrison had salvaged from an old barn. The wood was perfect for the purpose, seasoned by years of service, marked by time, but still strong and beautiful. Each letter took shape under his careful attention. Mercer Boone Wildlife Sanctuary. The sanctuary had grown from an idea shared, over coffee, into something that attracted visitors from across the country. Environmental scientists came to study the remarkable recovery of the valley's ecosystem. Families brought their children to see animals living in natural harmony. Graduate students wrote dissertations about sustainable land management practices that seemed to emerge organically from the partnership between human stewardship and natural wisdom. Jake had been the first to suggest formalizing Eli's role, offering him a permanent position as sanctuary manager with full authority over conservation decisions. "You've got a gift for this work," Jake had said, "and more importantly, you understand that protection means partnership, not domination." The transformation of the valley was visible everywhere Eli looked. Streams ran clear and strong, following courses that seemed to optimize water distribution across the entire ecosystem. Grasslands grew thick and healthy, supporting wildlife populations that had returned from distant refuges. Even the air itself felt different, cleaner, more alive, charged with the energy of a landscape that had rediscovered its natural balance. Boone appeared periodically, sometimes staying for days, sometimes just passing through on journeys that took him far beyond the valley's borders. The wolf had aged during their separation, his muzzle showing silver and his movements carrying the dignity of a creature who had fulfilled his greatest purpose. But his amber eyes remained as intelligent and knowing as ever, and his affection for Eli never diminished. During Boone's visits, the sanctuary experienced what Eli privately called amplification days, periods when the natural harmony became so pronounced that even skeptical visitors found themselves moved to silence and wonder. Animals that normally avoided human contact would approach within easy observation distance. Birds would perform aerial displays that seemed choreographed for maximum beauty. Plants would show accelerated growth that defied botanical explanation. "He's teaching us," Eli explained to a group of university students who had come to study what they called the Morrison Valley phenomenon. "Showing us what's possible when humans remember they're part of the ecosystem instead of separate from it." The students were documenting everything, creating scientific papers that tried to explain the sanctuary's success through conventional environmental science. Eli cooperated with their research, while knowing that the most important elements of what they were witnessing couldn't be captured in academic language. The work wasn't without its challenges. Sterling's corporation had eventually collapsed under federal investigation for water rights fraud and environmental manipulation. Multiple agencies were pursuing criminal charges related to the artificial drought and its devastating impact on rural communities. But other development interests circled the valley like vultures, seeking opportunities to exploit its restored value. Each new threat was met by a coalition that had grown stronger and more sophisticated since their original confrontation. Ranchers worked with tribal authorities and environmental groups to create legal protections that would survive changes in political leadership. Young lawyers, drawn to the sanctuary's mission, provided pro bono representation that matched anything corporate interests could afford. Eli found himself at the center of these efforts, his reputation as the Wolf Man of Morrison Valley bringing attention and resources that might not have been available to ordinary activists. He spoke at conferences, testified before legislative committees, and mentored young conservationists who came to learn from his experience. But the work he found most meaningful happened on a smaller scale, teaching children about the connections between all living things. School groups visited the sanctuary regularly, and Eli had developed programs that let urban kids experience direct contact with nature in ways their normal lives never allowed. "Every creature has a purpose," he would tell them as they watched. Deer grazing peacefully among cattle. Every plant, every insect, every animal contributes something essential to keeping the whole system healthy. Our job as humans isn't to control that system, it's to find our place within it. The children invariably asked about Boone, whose legend had spread through social media and environmental networks. Eli would tell them about the partnership between species, about respect and understanding that transcends the boundaries of language. Sometimes, if they were very lucky, Boone would appear during their visit, allowing the children to witness the reality behind the stories. On a crisp morning in late autumn, Eli found himself back at Hartwell's livestock auction for the first time since the day he'd claimed Boone. This time, he came not as a desperate man seeking work, but as someone with resources and purpose. Word had reached him about animals in need, creatures that others considered too dangerous, too damaged, or too expensive to save. The auction proceeded with its familiar rhythm, but Eli saw it through different eyes now. Where once he'd seen only commerce, he now recognized stories of connection and separation, of creatures seeking their proper place in a world that often failed to understand their value. When a terrified young coyote was brought forward, clearly destined for destruction despite its obvious intelligence and beauty, Eli stepped forward with quiet authority. "I'll take her," he said, his voice carrying the same calm certainty that had claimed Boone months before. The crowd murmured with recognition. The Wolfman was back, and another hopeless case was about to find salvation. As Eli completed the paperwork and arranged transport for the coyote, he felt Martha's presence as clearly as if she stood beside him. Her dream of building something lasting had taken a form neither of them could have imagined, but its heart remained the same, creating space in the world for love to flourish in unexpected forms. Driving home with the caged coyote in his truck, Eli caught sight of movement on a distant ridge. Boone stood silhouetted against the afternoon sky, watching over the valley that had become his monument and their shared legacy. The wolf's posture spoke of satisfaction and continuing vigilance, of duties fulfilled and bonds that transcended. In physical presence, the sacred spring stone, now permanently mounted near the sanctuary's entrance, caught the last rays of sunlight and seemed to pulse with warm approval. Visitors often asked about its significance, and Eli would tell them it represented the moment when a broken man and a wild wolf chose to trust each other with something more precious than their individual lives. As darkness settled over the valley, bringing with it the sounds of a restored ecosystem settling into evening rhythms, Eli reflected on the strange path that had brought him to this moment. He'd lost everything, ranch, wife, purpose, only to discover that some losses are preparation for gains that couldn't be imagined beforehand. The young coyote whined softly from her carrier, responding to the gentle sounds of Eli's voice as he spoke to her about patience and hope, about second chances and the family that forms when broken things choose to heal together. Somewhere in the darkness, Boone howled once, not with loneliness or challenge, but with the satisfaction of a guardian whose watch continues, whose partnership with humanity has proven that love, indeed, never dies, but simply finds new forms to serve the continuation of all life.